So where does the money come from? So in 2013, most organisations had one source of public sector funds, City Council in particular, obviously, because they run very small grants programmes, so you have lots of micro organisations, that's where you're going to get a grant from. So I'll do the public sector stuff first. So this is what it looks like now. So public sector funding is going up, and the NHS has gone up slightly. So remember that figure I said before? Health and wellbeing, 44%? 11% funding. 11% of groups get funding from the NHS, but 44% of our sector's activities is going on around health and wellbeing. So we are saving the NHS a heck of a lot of money, I would suggest. And that's a point I should be making to them repeatedly. Yes. Now, this is one of my favourite bits next. Oh yes, 89. 71% of organisations had at least one non-public sector source of funding. 89% now. That's way ahead of anywhere else in Greater Manchester and the whole of Greater Manchester by a huge margin. That tells you something really, really powerful about what's going on. And look at how it breaks down across all the different things. So, fundraising. So this is, doing things to bring money in through donations or, kind of charitable giving has leapt from 30 to just over half. Grants, massive increase, 24 to 58. So I think, charging, 18, gone up to 42. I'm starting to sound like I'm doing top of the pops now. And this one in particular, Manchester was regarded as one of the problem areas for the lottery because there wasn't support available when this first started up. We'd only just really got going as the support organisation. And I think, again, I'm going to take a little bit of credit for Macc for this, but also for the work of the voluntary sector. 45% of organisations now getting lottery funding of some form in the last few years. That's a brilliant success in turning around something we were notorious for losing out on. But you look at all those things, and what that says is that's a very, very enterprising sector working their backsides off to bring the resources in. That's a huge successful story for us at a very, very difficult time. And there's some stuff to think through about what that means. But if you compare that to other parts of Greater Manchester, we are being very, very smart at raising new sources of income and support. But it means harder work to get the money in. And this is how that plays out in terms of impact. So you've got annual income, annual expenditure, and reserves. Any good organisation needs a certain level of reserves, particularly if you employ staff, because you might have to pay them redundancy costs one day. And what this shows is the number of organisations who've seen an increase in their income is 47%, compared to the number who've seen an increase in their expenditure, which is 57%. So all that stuff about we are working harder to bring the money in, that's because it's going out faster. The level of consistency is round about a quarter, but this is the worrying thing. The numbers of organisations who are seeing their reserves decrease is growing, and that's going to have a knock-on effect in years to come, I think. But yeah, that tells you that story, which we probably all knew anyway, about more and more organisations are having to fight harder and do more stuff with less and less money coming in and less security. So it gets quite alarming when you see figures like this. 30% of our organisations have less than a month's money in the bank. Now, that might sound really high, but actually it's probably not a problem for most of our organisations, because remember, 2,200 and odd are tiny. Micro organisations run on less than 10 grand a year. They don't necessarily need a month's money in hand, because they possibly do 2 or 3 things during the year, you know, a big summer activity, a big winter activity, and maybe 1 or 2 other bits and bobs. That's not so much a problem. It's this one, I think, is the bigger problem. That's 3 months running costs, 25%. That's the level of reserves you would need if you've got staff. Now, more than half of our sector's organisations, and you're way beyond just the micro-organisations there. You're into the organisations who have employees and have running costs, and we're finding it harder to hold on to reserves. Most of you will know that that's because funders don't let you keep surplus money anymore. You certainly don't get a margin on anything in order to invest in your organisation's running costs. It is do everything, no you can't have any overheads, no you can't keep any spare cash. It's getting tougher and tougher to be entrepreneurial. So all that effort, and our organisations are potentially getting more fragile because of things becoming tighter. Now, don't want to overplay that, but it's worth noting. Now, here we are, relationships. So, these are always fairly healthy, and there's always an interesting story to tell with the NHS, and I'm not picking on you guys. It's just, I'm not. So, relationships with the City Council, fairly stable, 82 before, 84% now. NHS Manchester was probably artificially high because I think they were going through one of their rare periods of not being reorganised at the time we did the last survey. So that's something you see going round in cycles. I can remember 3 health authorities. That's how far back I go in the list of NHS reorganisations. But that fluctuates, and it's near enough to the 44% of our sector that works on health and wellbeing for that to feel fairly comfortable. It's probably dipped a little bit because of all the changes that have been going on. University, again, still fairly strong. Now, the private sector is interesting, and you'll see in the pack you've got our Spirit of Manchester business thing, because this is us trying to think ahead. 66%, the figures are fairly the same. It's the what do they tell us. 66% of our organisations have some relationship with the private sector in some way. Right? 2/3 of us are working with a private business or one or more. Only 1/4 of us think it's worth bothering with. That's quite a lot of effort going into something that we don't think necessarily produces a positive result. When it does, it pays off massively. That's the stuff that came out of the focus groups. When it works, it can work brilliantly. But we're putting a lot of effort and not getting a great deal back from it. Well, that's how it feels. So there is a question for us to think about as a sector about how much time do we spend on this, but also, are we actually spending the right time and having the right conversation with the private sector? And I would argue that we're probably not. We're probably doing a bit too much of please fundraise for us when actually we could be thinking about other forms of collaboration. So have a look at the Spirit of Manchester business stuff, which Helen and Anika have done a lot of work on, and that will give you a sense of where we're suggesting the conversation needs to go. I'll try and rattle on. So this is working with each other. Again, I think there's a knock-on here from the changes in staffing. So we're still bumping into each other, but it feels like our opportunities to actively collaborate are dropping. So working together in contact, you've got 90 odd percent, 70 odd percent. There's a fair amount of contact with each other, but actually collaborating on things like influencing decisions or delivering services has dropped quite significantly. And I suspect, be interesting to get your thoughts on this, that's because of the pressures that our sector's been under in terms of staffing, fundraising, delivery, just getting on and doing more stuff. So there's a little question about whether we've either lost the trick of doing that, or we've not become convinced that it's worth doing anymore because there's a bit more competition, whatever.